So to start, we'll have Dr. Stephen Matthews with the Ohio State University. He'll be talking on climate change tree atlas, a tool to explore potential responses of Ohio forests. So let's welcome Stephen.
All right. Oh, I'm going to be back from there. So I'm good. No, I was too close to that. However, okay, it's good. Cool. Get that straight. Okay, perfect. Awesome. Cool. Thank you. Well, it's good to be here. And thanks a lot for having me talk. As with any sort of presentation, this is obviously a very collaborative piece of work to talk about. It's been something we've been doing for the past 20 years or so. And so it's really nice to be able to always come out and share a little bit about the work, but really the goal today is to really talk about the ways in which hopefully you all can explore some of these data. So Climate Change Tree Atlas is a project from the Northern Research Station and Forest Service. It really started with Louis Iverson and Nathan Prasad. I came on in about 2000, and we've continued to develop this as a tool for both scientists as well as citizens and land managers. So I'll just kind of jump in and talk about that. If there's questions, I'm happy to take them anytime or at the end. Really, kind of what I want to talk about today, right, there are just a couple of dimensions. And really going to focus more on forests as it relates to climate change, right? So we know climate is changing, we know species, our forests are responding in lots of different ways. We understand that as these changes continue to kind of accelerate, we really need to come up with these adaptive strategies. And we think, we feel, and we've seen in some ways that the ways in which the climate change tree atlas has been used as a part of that, right? It's very much just the beginning to try to understand how tree species are changing and potentially responding to climate change. And at the end of the day, right, it's something that we're really motivated by is this idea of collaboration and forming collaborations to develop new projects. So that's kind of where I'm entering into this talk, and so it's really great to be here and to have a chance to share a little bit about that. I'm not going to talk a lot about climate change per se here, right? I really want to focus more on the forest aspect. I just wanted to just present, just to show and demonstrate, right? When we're talking about these aspects, right? In order for us to get to shifting species, right? We just want to understand the context of shifting seasons. So by that, I mean contemporary changes that we've seen in accelerating amounts of climate change. And important to this topic is that, it's not homogeneous. It's very heterogeneous the way in which it can change. So whether we're thinking about winter versus summer, temperatures, variability in precipitation, all these factors are going to be really important for us to consider as we want to address and understand how forests would likely respond to continued changes. Right? So we think about the framework, right? Changes in climate, temperature, and precipitation, right? What are the responses that we would see within forests? And so hopefully this is not new to many of you all here, right? But we have these documented different ways in which trees, plants in general, are responding to the changes we've seen already. Whether it's changes in growing season over the last century. For me also, not only do I work with trees, but I also work a lot with birds, so think about those phenological changes as well. Thinking about the way in which growing season itself, right, has shifted. And what does that mean about the way in which plants are competing with each other? So this idea that we have these shifting seasons, right, they impart different stressors. Different trees are going to be able to deal with this differently, right? And then ultimately, how do these kind of scale down to influence the way in which organisms are interacting? So what we have presented here, which I'll be talking about today, is this line of research that we've been conducting. So this development around the climate change tree atlas and bird atlas. And really our motivation is kind of rooted in our central question that we want to ask. And it's really about landscape ecology, understanding how species respond to climate change in terms of their distributions. And the atlas is really kind of that way in which we hope to make that science more accessible to groups like you all here in the audience, but as well as more broad an audience as we can. So just to give you a little hint about it, and also to maybe give you a a picture of how this is developed over time, right? Because nothing is linear, right, in the way in which we work, right? So we start off with kind of developing a way in which we want to understand, a way in which we can think about how can we characterize current species distributions and what those habitats look like, right? This gives us a sense of species vulnerability. This is where we essentially started around 2000. We kind of fast forward to the next stage, right, where we want to develop this online. We want to think about what other characteristics would be important to think about for species. And this is incorporating life history characteristics. And this allows us to start thinking about what is the adaptive capacity for species to respond to change. Moving forward to the next round of work, right, is to think about how can we combine that species information to make more localized kind of estimates of how tree communities may be influenced by climate change, right? This idea of a local capacity, capability. Moving forward to the current piece, which I'm going to talk about today, and this is just kind of an outline in many ways, right? It's this idea of thinking about, we know trees can't get up and move, right? So how do we incorporate this idea of what is the potential for tree species to migrate over the next century? So it's going to be a much smaller window. That allows us to think about questions, right, on the side of assisted migration. What are the pros and cons of thinking of those? And then ultimately where we currently are. It never ends, right? The bubbles keep growing in terms of the scope of our work. One thing, certainly wanted to present here is the way in which the data for this tool is used. And this idea that it's used, right, in lots of different ways and avenues, but just to kind of give you a sense, right, some of the great ways in which we've interacted and gotten enthusiasm, whether it's thinking about how the public is interacting with the Climate Change Atlas, how it's used within education, right? There's some really neat lesson plans that have been developed throughout the country around those, whether we're collaborating with state and federal land, right? Or other ways in which they can utilize this information to their forest plans and certainly national forest systems. Whether we're talking about within urban areas and deciding about tree species to plant, or whether it's our other colleagues and researchers trying to develop the next generation of understanding how species are responding to environmental change. So for us, this is always one of the big, exciting and motivating things to see how people are using these data in their everyday lives. So the atlas itself, this kind of latest version kind of tried to update a lot of the information, not only the latest science, but also make it more accessible. And what I want to do now is essentially give you a sense for what's there. Maybe talk a little bit more about the results in general, and then I'll hopefully spar some questions, and we'll be able to go into a couple of examples to try to provide some more information on that. First, so what I'm going to talk about next is this series. First, the way in which we think about species habitats and distributions, right? So what is the distribution, right, of the species? Think about how we can utilize information about life history characteristics to think about the adaptability of potential tree species to respond. And then finally, what is this idea of species' ability to migrate? And so the first component, right, is that piece that we often think about. Excuse me. Is this idea of how and why do we think about a species distribution, right? And so for this, we have been using heavily, there's a program across the U.S. of forest inventory analysis, which is folks going out and collecting inventory data, right? Many hundreds of thousands of lots, right? We also, right, that gives us our current kind of abundance in many ways of each individual tree species. And when I say each species, we typically work with 125 trees at this point. So I'm just giving you one example for sugar maple. So if we want to think about sugar maple distribution within eastern North America, what kind of things do we want to know? We want to ask the question of why sugar maples occur where they do. What kind of pieces might you want to incorporate in that? Any idea? What would you do? Yeah.
Soil.
Yep, soil. When you think about soil, right, there's many different components to that. The soil. You think of soil types, characteristics, soil properties, right? And so those are kind of the first things we try to go out and get. So we use Surgo soil data, right, which is another national inventory type of soil data to kind of characterize these soil characteristics. So you have soil. What else might we want to know if we were thinking about in terms of what determines where sugar maples are going to occur?
Amount of rainfall.
Yeah, precipitation. Yeah, and so it's not just the year-round rainfall, but it's also maybe during the growing season, right? We also want to, go for it. Please.
Aspect?
Yep, exactly. So components with elevation. So these models are relatively coarse, right? So we think about 10 by 10 kilometer components. So what we do for that in this case, right, is think about what is the variation within elevation within an area, right? Other metrics of elevation. And I get back to that central piece that's really important to things like survey maple, right, where they occur on certain slopes and aspects, right? Certain soil types, certain amount of precipitation, certain climates. And that's essentially what we do, right? We want to ask that first question of where does sugar maple occur, right? What are the environmental variables that are associated with that? If we understand that, then we can project how those habitats may change. So I notice I said habitats, not species, would change under climate change. So if we were to, in this case, I'm showing results from two different kind of emissions pathways, right? I'm not going to go into too much of this here, but right, there's essentially three different GCMs kind of that we're looking at. This is the average of those three, kind of under this medium emissions. So this would be a RCP 4.5. Whereas RCP 8.5, right, is a little bit more higher emissions, more sensitive, as you would say, this number, actually a multiplier, of the amount of force we have in climate change. More climate change, less climate change, right? And so then we can begin to understand how those habitats may respond. Great. So you guys passed the test about how we model species distribution, so that's great. So of course we know that that's not all of it, right? Just these environmental variables are all very much just associations, right? And we want to know more, and we have more information about how trees are interacting with the environment. And so for this, at this kind of level, we want to think about what are specific life history traits that we would want to consider, right? And so what we did is we went into the literature for all of our tree species, and it's grown to about 200 or so now. This is 125 is on the atlas, but we have a bunch more information, right? Where we kind of, we evaluate all these different biological life history traits, how shade tolerant it is, that's the important one for sugar maple for sure, right? As well as these different characteristics of how they respond to disturbance. And so what we can do, if we do this in a consistent way and systematic way, we can then begin to build these profiles of species and potential adaptability, right? So in this case, on one end we have balsam fir, right? On the other end we have red maple, right? And if we think about how we score these across all of those species, we can think how a species is potentially responding to disturbance in regards to climate change, and then in terms of biological characteristics. And what we would find, right, we would find, in this case, right, that balsam fir kind of falls on this bottom quadrant, potentially lower adaptability, right? We think about disease, we think about insect pests, we think about its tolerance with environmental characteristics, right? It's much narrower than a species like red maple, right? That does really well in lots of components, very shade tolerant, very competitive, right? It scores high. So this is a way in which we can think about adaptability. Put those two pieces together, have that change in adaptability, we have a new perspective about the capability of those species to respond to climate change. And then the third piece, right, is that trees aren't going to get up and move, right? And we really want to understand what is this likelihood, right? If we can take a species like northern red oak, we see its current distribution and its projected habitat, right? What is the likelihood that those habitats could potentially be filled within the next 100 years, right? And for that, we can look at this at a much finer resolution, right? And get a sense of those areas that are darker blue, right, have some probability of being colonized, whereas obviously places like Maine, northern Maine are going to be very hard, right, to colonize, right? So we can do this across all the species that we have, right? And we can start to observe and think about patterns that we have. And so I'm just going to give you a couple contrasting examples. So we can think about species like eastern pine, we can think about its current distribution, its model future habitat, or projected declines. This is just the difference map between those two, right? And so if we are in the mid-Atlantic region, we would say that this protected habitat declines to about 20%. And we also want to be cognizant, right, of these attributes like history characteristics that might allow it to do a little better, or ones that might be multiplicative and maybe do a little worse, right? So that's what we're trying to build these profiles that we can mix for species. So that's this eastern white pine, a species projected to decline. We also have a species that may be projected to do better, right, under these conditions. So sweet gum would be would be a kind of a classic example of that, right? You think about its current distribution, its projected future habitat, right? We see this potential area for lots of gains in habitats. There are some challenges, right? Especially think about increases in drought potential, right? It's kind of tolerance to fire in many ways, but we can then think about what is the potential for sweet gum to colonize those new air habitats. Right? We see it very much confined along its northern edge of its current range. And this starts to give us a sense if you're interested in either tree species. We have a lot of information right to explore within the campus. But we want, again, to take this another step forward and say, how can these data be useful, right, to the public, to land managers, right? And so this is where we wanted to combine this information into regional summary tables. In this case, I'm just showing, for example, if we were to combine those into 1 by 1 degree grids and summarize the species. So we can already get a quick glimpse of that, right? There's areas here, this is the number of species, where you have the number of species that have this core capability to cope, right? So this kind of combination of habitat and like history characteristics. Whereas on the converse, right, species that have this potential to migrate, right, as you would expect to move into the northeast corner. That's interesting from my side standpoint, but it doesn't necessarily give us all that information. So if we go to the Atlas website, there's a whole section about regional summary tables. And in this, right, you can look up a variety of different components. You can look at these specific regions that we've already evaluated. You can look at the 1 by 1 degree grids, right? You can look at the states. So in this case, I'm just going to pull out an example for Southeast Ohio, because it's a place where we're pretty actively working. It'll kind of fit in with one of the other examples, but I could have picked right here and get the same information I'm going to present here. So the first piece is the next slide isn't supposed to be a shock. So that's your warning, right? The first thing you would get when you would click on one of those summary tables, right, is a whole bunch of information. I know folks can't see it back there, so let me break it down into 2 quick components. This kind of top part, right, is a lot of numbers, but it's all characterizing how you would summarize all of the species that are kind of in that given region. So in this case, right, there's 113 species, 78 species are present kind of now, right, according to the ones we have we are evaluating. And then what you start to see is this really interesting patterns, right? 37 of those species are projected to decline, 23 are projected to increase by about 20% in our habitat, right? That already presents some interesting concepts, right, of how species would be potentially interacting in such a situation. And then essentially, 13 of those species are essentially new to the region in many ways. The bottom part here, right, provides that summary around the climate, right? And there's a couple key important aspects to show. One, right, that we have it's important to look at multiple different models, right, in terms of climate models, right? These 2 different emission scenarios. This is showing annual temperature. And then the bottom one, right, is really indicating this aspect between difference between growing season temperature and growing season precipitation. Right? And you can kind of see it from here, right? Growing season precipitation, right? There's some scenarios where it's kind of increasing, but most of it's flat or declining, where the growing season temperature is increasing each of those. Right? So this presents unique challenges that trees would potentially face that are certainly water limited during the growing season. And that's why you have these different responses. The next kind of tab within those tables provides all of that information, right? And we're not going to go through all of them. I just wanted to show you that there's a lot of information, right, about whether it's your favorite species, how its habitat is projected to change, right? What's its ability to adapt, and then its combination. And I'll also point out that not all models, right, not all tree species are that easy to deal with, right? So species like red maple, we have pretty high confidence in our ability to capture its distribution, right? Whereas other species, right, may be harder. Okay, so sassafras are harder species for us to capture. So it's just being transparent. So if I just look at a couple species here, so we look at white oak, American beech, right, southern red oak, they all provide kind of different patterns. We can zoom in then and look at the maps. So for species like white oak, right, we're focusing in on kind of southeast Ohio. It has this potential for a slight small increase. right? Which is important, right? Because right now, species like oaks, right, are having challenges with regeneration. So so if you can get them through that bottleneck, right, certainly it would suggest they may have some abilities to persist and do well. Whereas a species like American beech, right, has this potential in Southeast Ohio, right, to have declines in habitat, right? So these are kind of the contrasting pieces. While a species like southern red oak, right, while it's not currently, while it can present within the region of Southeast Ohio, it has this pretty decent likelihood of being able to migrate there within the next few years. And I'll talk a little bit about in a bit, right, how we're actually right now conducting experiments on the ground to test that, right, planting southern red oaks, right, in this context of forest to understand their ability to develop. And so that kind of leads to these examples of applications that I want to provide. The Northern Forest Climate Hubs, right, is a really great kind of partner, as well as the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Sciences. So for a long time, they've been developing with land managers and scientists alike, all of us, right, to develop these vulnerability assessments for different regions across the state. Right? We also see really interesting examples of how these data are being used both in urban forest planning. There's a nice section within the urban forest master plan within Columbus that utilizes these data to think about climate change and the types of trees they'd be prioritizing, as well as the agroforestry center, right? Thinking about the specific ways the ecosystem service components, agroforestry, the types of trees that are focused on provide food resources or other benefits, right? And we can think about their ways in which we contributed to addressing, right, climate change within that important aspect of agroforestry handbook. The other example, right, kind of relates specifically to this idea of how we're trying to study this within the field, this idea of adaptive silviculture for climate change. And there's a network of sites across North America that are really trying to understand the ways in which we can manage forests in order to make sure they're more resilient, right, and sustainable under climate change. And so we're fortunate here within Ohio to have one of these sites in Benton Furnace Experimental Forest, where, right, we kind of 2 years ago kind of initiated this study with a whole bunch of collaborators, as you can see there. But the key thing for us here to think about is this is a way in which we can get on the ground forest management and silviculture that addresses those components of climate change. And so there's essentially three main components that we're exploring. One is this idea of resistance within the forest. How can you maintain the forest relatively unchanged for their current conditions by using management actions, right? In this case, maintaining oak-dominated forests, where it matches the overstore, right? The next aspect is testing resilience. So allowing some species to change, right, that are currently present within there. So we think about the types of management we are kind of implementing, right? So you have these gaps, okay, potentially being influenced, right? Thinking about making sure competition, right, can allow for natural regeneration within those forests. And then transition, right, where we're facilitating change, right, in order to allow those species that may not be present or are very low abundance to potentially grow, right, under these conditions and serve as the next forest. So it's a test, right, an experiment of that. And so in this case, right, selecting species that are present, but also thinking about seed sources that would allow us to test how well are these models working, but more importantly, how can we make sure that our forests remain healthy under unprecedented amount of change over the next century. So that's been a really exciting project to do. If we zoom a little bit further out, right, it's also important to acknowledge, right, that as these components of forest change occur, right, and the reason I'm showing this is because Andy Gowdy, this paper just came out like a week ago, so maybe I'm a little too enthusiastic to share it here. But what I think has an important message is, because if you think about, if we look across all of North America, 300 and some species that we're looking at in this case, we have the current forest composition, right? We go out into a forest and we expect and see a certain community of trees, right? And we essentially do this for all across North America. right, we can evaluate, well, what is the potential, right, for these novel and disappearing forest assemblages to occur across the region. And what we find, right, as this kind of color gets, so we go from purple to yellow, as we kind of move more towards yellow, this kind of indicates more novel community compositions. Dissimilarity, how dissimilar are these forests, right, across this region. Right, so we quickly begin to see, right, there's certain patterns within North America where we have forests that are a bit more emerging as novel conditions. So what this means is, right, this implies, right, that there's more unique pressures, right, in terms of that forest community. And so we kind of fit within that middle range here within Ohio. And then we can do this across all of North America and start to see the flow of these different habitats. And it makes sense in many ways, right? This potential eastern temperate forest, right? There's some many that stay the same. There's a portion of those that transition potentially into conditions that are more like northern forests, right? Northern forest, a large portion of northern forest projected to change more to like type. So this kind of progression in march of different forest composition, which is really important as we think about in terms of management. And I couldn't resist not adding the last couple minutes. The other component of the Climate Change Atlas is the Climate Change Bird Atlas. And so while we have created lots of great tools, right, to be involved in terms of management and thinking about climate change and vulnerability for trees, right, there's also a large opportunity to do this for birds as well. Since we modeled and explored 147 bird species as part of the Climate Change Atlas. So the same type of information for trees, we also have for birds. And what I just wanted to express really quickly here is that within Ohio, right, we have a lot of great resources that identify species of conservation concerns, species that are priority species both in Ohio and continentally. And we have a pretty large overlap of species that we've explored in terms of climate change that fit within these kind of high priority conservation birds. So 26 of these 32 focal priority bird species and things like this forest management guide, we've evaluated. And we can start to understand some important patterns if we just look at that same portion within Ohio or within the Central Appalachians. We can see, just like we saw within that one example, right, there's many species that are projected to decline in habitat within that region, right? Many of those species projected to decline, I just have the low emissions and high emissions, are species of high conservation concern. Right, so we can really apply that same method of thinking about regional summaries to focus line. And the other important thing I'll mention about the bird atlas is it actually uses this important tree species information. One thing that I've been interested in for a long time are the important ways that it's not just forest structure that's important to birds, but it's the particular species composition that's important. We have a couple papers that demonstrate that for birds in Southeast Ohio, tree species composition, in many cases, can be more important than structure alone, and it's really that co-information that's important. And these models incorporate that tree information that was presented to them. And so just to make sure to keep up with time here, make sure you have plenty of time for questions. And I just want to say thanks for allowing me to come talk a little bit about kind of the Climate Change Tree Atlas tool. We'll try to make it more about what's there than providing you a bunch of results. And hopefully encouraging you all to explore it. But the idea that climate is changing, and these dynamics are really important to understand, especially if we're thinking about forest resilience, bird species conservation, and really these models in many ways are just one part of the picture to help managers come up with these novel strategies, right, that allow us to maintain a productive and healthy forest. With that, I'm gonna wrap it up. So thanks very much. I don't know if there's any question that you have. Yeah.
I just had a question. You mentioned at the beginning that you might talk a little bit about assisted migration.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit and what the general view is, if there is one?
Yeah. I definitely can talk about that. So this idea, the component of trying to identify, right, so systemized migration in general, right? So we think about the pace of climate change, we think about, in many ways, outpacing the ability for our species to respond. So what are the decisions that come around in terms of, do you move the species? And the questions become, do you move them within their current range, right? Maybe a species like white oak, right? For the good example would be the asp study. So we have species that are naturally regenerating, right? In Southeast Ohio that are white oak, and we're going to encourage those to grow. But we're also testing the seeds from the Ozark, which is a region that has this climate analog, to Southeast Ohio by the end of the century to evaluate that kind of movement within a population. So that's one way we think about assisted migration, making sure we're thinking about locally adapted sources, right? The other one is moving outside of the range, right? What is the potential for moving species that are beyond their current range boundary, right? And it can create lots of challenges in terms of policy and thinking around conservation, right? And so this idea, the way in which we kind of evaluate species' ability to migrate kind of gives us this window that really beyond 200 kilometers past the current species range boundaries is really all that species would be expected to be able to migrate over the next 100 years. So beyond that, assisted migration aspects would need to come into play. And to do that, you have to think about what are the other species present in the location, how adaptable those species are those seed sources going to be able to move into those areas. So it's not without controversy, but it's a really important question that we have, right, and focus on.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how much you've looked at how much invasive species and habitat fragmentation would act as barriers to migration.
Yeah, and that's a really important, yeah, exactly. And that is always going to be a limiter. And so in our kind of current work, where we're focusing more on species across North America, we certainly see that. And I will say, like a lot of the migration pieces we do, we're able to do that at a much finer resolution. It still may sound coarse, but it's like a 1 kilometer resolution. So the ability, the fragmentation, connectivity of the landscape becomes a really important aspect of that distance, right? And immediately kind of influencing and shaping that. But we can think also about it because there's other species. Again, my other bias of working with birds. The last 5 or so years, we've been focusing on this ability for blue jays to move acorns. So we put transmitters in acorns, and we give them the blue jays, and we let them take them, and they go and find them, right? And so this idea of like, what is their dispersal distance? In some cases, within fragmented landscapes, they can move them pretty far. So it's a really important aspect. And the invasive species, right, is a really important topic. Obviously, one that anyone who spends any time out in the woods knows that's a challenge, and we don't necessarily directly address that, right? And so that's one that we have to, and it's that local knowledge and ability to control it is ultimately key. That's what we have to talk to. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there any are there any plans to make this sort of like have a, I don't know, some sort of thing within this where like homeowners and just landowners that have just a few acres could say, oh, well, this is super useful for me, or oh, I should plant this, et cetera, or is it mostly for like maybe like larger landowners?
So it's totally meant to be for anyone, right? And I think it's with that caveat, like, so right now we kind of provide this by a 1 kilometer area, so it's pretty coarse. But that's in part to recognizing that there's a lot of variability at those finer spatial areas. So like one thing I always encourage, like for landowners and homeowners, right, that think about that, want to think about these components is, right, evaluating that list of species, right, is there. And so right now we have it broken into these 1 kilometer, so if you kind of know which grid you're in, you get that full list. And it has all the components about species change, and at the end of it, right, and there's lots of documentation, right, about what those values mean. But it's really meant not to provide the answer, it's meant to provide an informed kind of list of how we think about change. So that's there, and then I will say the next kind of iteration that we're currently working on, which should be out by this summer, is just something that's more spatially explicit. So like a ArcGIS online AGL where you can just click your area. So that's almost done. And it works, but it's not. Right.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks.
being aware of time, because I know. Okay. Any other yeah, quick notes? All right. Thanks very much, appreciate it.